holds 2 masters and 2 bachelors, both of them in the areas of philosophy and history. He has published numerous books and articles on the history of Western Cuba. In recent years, the scope of his work has further expanded and takes the Anthropocene as its point of departure, while retaining an emphasis on the assumptions, ambitions, practices, and institutions of pre-modern Western Europeans that antedated the Industrial Revolution, while fostering the anthropogenic trajectories that led our planet out of the Holocene. Thank you, Professor Gregory, for being here with us tonight.
For the invitation on behalf of the Institute to be here. This is my first time ever to UTEP, first time ever in El Paso, and I've had just a fantastic couple of days, enhanced by the fact that yesterday between 4 and 5 inches of snow fell in South Bend, Indiana. So I'm very glad to be here under sunny skies and warm temperatures. I also want to give just a really strong shout out of gratitude to my extraordinary student hosts today, Mariana and Rafael and Pablo. The 3 of you, if you decide you don't want to go into your chosen disciplines and study what you're studying for here at UTEP, you could form a hospitality agency. and you guys would be absolutely fantastic. They just took such great care of you today, so I'm very grateful for that. Thanks to all of you too for coming this evening. I'm grateful. So my main scholarly area of expertise, and people can hear me in the back?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. You start to go like this.
Yep.
Suddenly I start to go wrong. That's unlikely. My main areas of scholarly expertise are the Reformation era, 16th and 17th century Western Europe, religious life in its embeddedness in the world of that very distant time and place. But that world began in the late Middle Ages. And so in order to understand what happened in the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Reformation, we have to understand something about what preceded it, namely late medieval Western Europe, late medieval Christianity, and the late medieval church. So this is all by way of saying that even though I study mostly the 16th and the 17th centuries, I've also been reading about, thinking about, and writing about the late Middle Ages to some extent as the predecessor period to my principal area of expertise, and I've been doing that for now over, I can't believe it, but it has been now over 30 years. So my remarks this evening are going to be about the Middle Ages in Western Europe, but they're also going to be about the place that the Middle Ages occupy in long-term historical narratives. That is, the sorts of long-term narratives that about change over centuries that tend to be the kind of unstated or stated core of popular conceptions about historical change over time. They're also the basic bedrock or framework of most textbook historical accounts of the sweep of history over this past half millennium, or even longer. We could extend back really to 1,000 years in terms of the Middle Ages, between that time and the present. But most of all, these popular images constitute a kind of polemical image that's really more about using a sometimes quite distorted view of the past in order to defend certain ideas, to shore up certain agendas in the present. So I'm not going to be talking only about the Middle Ages per se, but also about uses and abuses of images of the Middle Ages for various purposes in the present. That's one of the responsibilities, as I see it, for professional historians. It's to guard against this sort of use, to call out distortions and polemical uses of history. I mean, after all, if all of our reading and analyzing and thinking and writing about thousands of sources from long dead people is good for something, it's certainly good for that, among other things. If we don't do this, nobody else will do it, because nobody else has the time or the training or the knowledge to say, hey, you know what you're saying about those people in the past is not on the mark. So one of the things I'd like you to take away from this evening, to remember from it, is that the actual human past in every time and place, the Middle Ages is only one example, but the actual lived human past in every time and place was almost always much more complicated and messier and more difficult to generalize about than the way in which it's portrayed usually in common popular image, whether those images and generalizations are positive or negative. Okay then, so the basic structure of my remarks this evening is going to be as follows. First of all, I'm going to say something about the most common dominant image with respect to the Western or the Latin Middle Ages, namely that sees it as a backward, superstitious, ignorant, oppressive, intellectually stagnant era because it was, at the same time, a religiously repressive era. Between the fall of the Roman Empire and the beginning of modernity, commonly thought to start with the Renaissance in the 14th and 15th century, followed then another layer on top of that, the Protestant Reformation, rising still later than that, the 17th and 18th century Enlightenment, and the Middle Ages prior to that having been dominated with ill effects by the Catholic Church and its clergy. Essentially, this is the Middle Ages, a view that I'm sure all of you have encountered in one way or another, that sees the Middle Ages as fundamentally the Dark Ages. A period that had to be cast off and got beyond before the progress of the modern era could get underway. In short, the attitude toward the Middle Ages seen this way is, well, thank goodness we're past that, right? Good riddance. And I'll elaborate some on this image and then say a few things about some of the problems with it. So that's the first part of the talk. After that, I'm going to talk about a less common, but also recognizable, a sort of minority Catholic counter-image about the Latin Middle Ages, namely that sees it as a period of extraordinary faith and piety, a world characterized by an organic, harmonious society, permeated by shared beliefs, common values rooted in the Catholic Church, that sees it as a beautifully ordered world in which life was overwhelmingly simpler, it was more meaningful, it was more secure than it had become in the modern era. This is the Middle Ages seen essentially as the opposite of the Dark Ages. This is the Middle Ages as the Golden Age. A golden age that's been lost through the regrettable rejections of the church by the Reformation and the Enlightenment, modern philosophy, modern institutions. In short, here we have the Middle Ages seen with a kind of nostalgic yearning for an ostensibly better, bygone world that's tragically been lost. I'll say a little bit about this image too, and some of the problems with it. And then finally, at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit briefly by way of conclusion about what I think is actually going on when images like this are used in the ways that they are. And I'm going to concentrate, especially in that part of the lecture, on the first of the two images, the dominant Middle Ages as the Dark Ages portrayal. How it's being used in the service of current commitments and causes that's linked to a basic either-or binary of long-term historical change that's meant to validate and justify the present, not to try to actually understand medieval persons and their world. All right, so we've got tripartite. Those of you of a Christian theological mentality that want to see a Trinitarian structuring in that can do so. Otherwise, it's just three parts. So, I don't know a single medieval historian, not one, that would regard the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages. And yet this image, this stereotype persists. It persists especially perhaps in common views about the ostensible, timeless warfare or conflict between science on the one hand and religion on the other. So with this portrayal, we can trace the persistent and yet the diminished influence of the ancient Roman Empire, its institutions, practices, patterns of life endure long beyond, in a fragmented way, long beyond the beginning of the breakdown of the Roman Empire in the western part of Europe in the 5th century. But with this view, it's almost as if society and culture fell into a black hole for a millennia, 1,000 years, when everything got so much worse, and there was little, if anything, to admire, and all kinds of things to criticize and condemn. So what are some of the main features of this image of the Middle Ages? One of them is that the church, and especially the Catholic clergy, supposedly controlled everything. Kind of like Soviet-style totalitarianism projected back into Middle Ages. Invariably, the Inquisition, capital T, capital I, right? Gothic letters dripping with blood is part of this. Yeah, I see smiles on people's faces, you know just what I'm talking about. Technology, primitive at this time, didn't change really much at all for hundreds of years. Almost everyone led lives of crushing endemic poverty. What little wealth there was radically unequal in its distribution. It was controlled by rulers. It was controlled by aristocratic and ecclesiastical elites. Classical learning of the ancient world, the legacy of ancient Greece and Rome, was lost. Indeed, it was even actively suppressed by the church. Again, fundamentally the clergy deliberately sought to keep ordinary people ignorant. The church was anti-intellectual, as opposed to science and knowledge. Superstition was absolutely widespread. This is an image I'm guessing you recognize. More or less, some heads nodding, so yeah, you know what I'm talking about. What are the problems with it? First of all, because of limitations in communication and travel, there was no way for the church or any other institution to exercise anything like the control that characterizes modern states, whether democratic or totalitarian. Nothing like this would have been possible in the ancient or the medieval or even the early modern periods, the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. The United States and other modern Western democracies are infinitely more surveillant and regulatory than the medieval church or any institution in the Middle Ages ever was, even at the height of the medieval papacy, let's say, of Pope Innocent III at the very end of the 12th and beginning of the 13th century. In fact, the vast majority of human life, in all of its aspects, was more local, was more particular, was more shaped by specific communities than in the world of modern nation states. And this continued to be the case for long after the Middle Ages. It endured well into the 19th century. The major watershed here is really industrialization that gets momentum and persists starting in the second half of the 19th century. And just a side note here on the Inquisition. There were inquisitorial practices in the Middle Ages. They were specific, commissioned by individual bishops in their dioceses, sometimes including the Bishop of Rome, aka the Pope, starting in the 12th century. But there was no standing established institution called the Inquisition in the Middle Ages. The Spanish, specifically the Spanish Inquisition, comes about for very particular circumstances in the very late 15th century. There's a reorganization of the Roman Inquisition that occurs in the 16th century. And incidentally, the 16th century Roman Inquisition, the scholars that have studied it most carefully, have shown that its procedures, its uses of evidence, its means of interrogating suspects and so forth, were the most sophisticated and the most progressive in the 16th century compared to what was going on at the same time in state judicial procedures. So most things that are believed about the Inquisition in the Middle Ages are mistaken. Technology was primitive compared to today. Yeah, so was technology before the Second World War, right, compared to today. But anybody who really considers, for example, the building techniques that were used to construct medieval cathedrals, and incidentally, in the last 5 years since the tragic fire of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, the guys that have been involved in the building, the reconstruction of the roof and the entire structure, they have expressed and extolled in all kinds of terms the unbelievable sophistication of the techniques of construction that were used, without any, of course, power equipment whatsoever. The practices and processes that were used to turn raw wool and linen and silk into sometimes astonishing and beautiful fabrics, or the virtuosity that was demanded in the artisanal hand papermaking or glass blowing or metalworking, or the creation and the use of movable type, the invention of the printing press, after all, a medieval invention from the 1450s, Gutenberg in Mainz in the Rhine Valley. To name only a few examples. If you think about these things, if you consider these things fairly, there's really no way to claim that medieval technology was primitive. And of course, technology can't be applied to a knowledge of nature that one doesn't have. Today that's true no less than it was in the Middle Ages. And considering what was known, medieval builders and craftsmen and artisans and artists and printers did impressively well. It's absolutely not the case that the millennium between the end of the Roman Empire and, say, 1500 was a static or a stagnant world without change. Western Europe by 1500 had been dramatically altered in terms of its built environment, existing technologies, economic practices, the construction and expansion of cities, for example, compared to when Charlemagne was crowned the Holy Roman Empire emperor in the year 800. Medieval human lives, of course, at all social levels, rich and poor, were very closely tied to rural agricultural cycles. When harvests were good, there was enough for everyone. There was more than enough, in fact. But when they weren't, peasants especially could face famine. It was a materially austere world for most people. But that isn't unique to or distinctive of the Middle Ages. It was true of the ancient world, and it remained true of Western Europe, again, well into the 19th century, long past the beginning of the Enlightenment and into the period of industrialization. In addition, starting with the so-called commercial revolution of the 11th and the 12th centuries, we see a major upturn of trade, the growth of cities, increase in population, a monetization of economic exchange, and a growth in prosperity. And that prosperity actually, in sort of counterintuitive ways, increased in the century after the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century. Partly that's because the wealth that existed was basically spread around in fewer hands. There were fewer people alive to spread it around. It tended to be wages increased, for example. And the century between 1350 and 1450 is regarded as the best for ordinary people in the entirety of the Middle Ages. As far as the condemnation of the radical inequalities of wealth in the Middle Ages, that's an argument that had a little bit more plausibility by way of contrast with our own times, before the effects of 40 plus years of neoliberalism. So, for example, in Florence in 1427, 10% of the population owned 68% of the wealth. Years ago, when I started to teach, I would say that, and students say, oh my gosh, that's terrible. Today in the US, 10% owns 67% of the wealth. But the current distribution of wealth in the US, at the very top, 1% of the US population owns over 30% of the wealth right now. That's more than 12 times as much as the bottom 50% of the population. So more than 160 million people own as much, 1/12 as much as the top 1% of the population. So, which society is more unjust in its distribution of resources? Right, this has been a focus of modern Catholic social teaching for those of you who are familiar with it. The inheritance of classical learning. There was a loss of classical learning in the centuries after the fall of Rome, but what remained was known, and it was highly valued. Whether that's in Benedictine monasteries, starting from the 6th century, or in the cathedral and monastic schools later on, that eventuated in the 12th and 13th century with the formation of the first universities, another medieval invention, with the recovery of Aristotle and his corpus in the 12th and 13th centuries. So medieval intellectuals are keen to make use of the best knowledge that they have. By the 13th century, that means the body of Aristotelian philosophy, which is why they made it the basis of their university curriculum throughout Western Europe, starting in the 13th century. It's a mistake, too, to think of the Renaissance as like a new period, a separate era of its own. It's a name for a series of trends that start in the late Middle Ages, including Renaissance humanism in the late 13th and 14th centuries, spreading throughout Europe in the 15th century. It augments and it enriches, sometimes clashing with medieval scholasticism. But Renaissance humanism was not some anti-Christian movement of recovering ancient learning and turning it against the church. That's a view that remains out there, the incredibly long-standing, important influence by a Swiss historian, Jakob Burckhardt, in the middle of the 19th century, that took basically that interpretation. What Renaissance humanism is, in fact, is using classical learning, whether that's Cicero's rhetoric, whether it's Plato's thought that's being recovered in fresh ways in the 15th century, whether it's using knowledge of Greek and Hebrew, the two original biblical languages, to renew the church and Christian practice. This is especially the case in Northern Europe in the early 16th century, extending right into the period of the early Reformation, best associated with Erasmus. The center for Renaissance humanism by the middle of the 15th century is none other than the papal court in Rome and monasteries. Catholic monasteries are crucial nurseries of Renaissance humanism in both Germany and in Italy. In the Middle Ages, the most valued knowledge of all is neither theology. So much for this. Sorry. I know, I'm just teasing. Once in a while, I do a lecture and I said something controversial, and I see somebody get a bad look in their face in the back, and they kind of like, stand up. I knew that was it's actually just to wake everybody up. Make sure, I'm not just like a robot up here reading my text. The most valued knowledge in the Middle Ages is not the recovery of ancient texts and authors and humanism. It's not even knowledge of the natural world. The most valuable knowledge is the knowledge of God's self-revelation in history. Above all, in the life and the teaching and the death and the resurrection of Christ. It's been handed down. That's what tradition means, tradere, to pass down, to hand along, by and through the church. Above all, through understanding and interpreting and teaching and endeavoring to live out what was conveyed in Scripture. All other knowledge, ideally, was supposed to serve the participation of all baptized Christians that came from the first-hand knowledge of practicing the virtues in imitation of Christ in community. It's understood as a foretaste of the hope for eternal life after death. All other knowledge had a place that was related to, yet subordinate to this kind of knowledge that mattered most. It is absurd to regard the medieval church as opposed to learning, knowledge, or indeed science, that is, knowledge of the natural world at the time. Nobody who actually reads medieval theology or philosophy or political thought could come away with that conclusion. It's very often, again, the way that that idea is used is usually little more than a kind of extension of anti-religious prejudice or presumptions about the incompatibility between religion and science. But the idea that there's somehow a perpetual intrinsic opposition between science and religion is an invention of the 19th century. And because, again, present audience exempted, I'm sure, but because so many Americans know so little history, they're easy prey, they're easy pickings for the likes of the new atheists and for authors like Steven Pinker on this and many other points. A good book to read on this, if you want to read a great historian, an expert on the history of the relationship between science and religion, I would recommend Peter Harrison, now retired. He's an Australian scholar who wrote a book called The Territories of Science and Religion, published in 2015. And I also, if you just want to read a great, amazing book about medieval science, I would suggest this book called The Light Ages, right? Not the Dark Ages, The Light Ages. The subtitle is The Surprising Story of Medieval Science. It's by a British scholar named Seb, as in short for Sebastian, Seb Falk, F-A-L-K, published in 2020. What he does is he uses the almost completely unknown story of this Benedictine monastic astronomer named John of Westwick, with a W-Y-K. He just sounds like he sprung out of Middle Earth, doesn't he? John of Westwick. And he uses it to construct medieval astronomy, its place within medieval science, and even more broadly within a medieval Christian world, which is a fantastic book, beautifully written. Okay, now I'm starting to mention specific books. That's always a bad sign, so we'll leave it there. I'm happy to take up any points that people want to in our discussion. All right. So what about the reverse view? If the Middle Ages, an era of superstitious backwardness, doesn't hold up, it's not supported by a fair consideration of the evidence or a responsible interpretation of it, what about the opposite view, which has traditionally had and still has its supporters among some Catholics, as it did in the 19th century among those who were involved in the Romantic movement, capital R. It's also held by certain critics of modernity as such, namely the view that the Middle Ages was a golden age of Catholic learning. What are some of the main features of this view? In contrast to modern chaos, confusion, disruption, social dislocation, the Middle Ages, in this view, was an era in which Christianity infused and ordered all of life, in which society was a kind of organic whole. The realization, like in actual life, of St. Paul's metaphor of the body, right, in which all the parts cooperate for the sake of the social body and for the common good. It's claimed that this is what the Latin Middle Ages was like in actual practice. And in place of secular self-assertion, relativistic individualism of the modern world, in the Middle Ages, everyone knew their place, they accepted their place, the church's authority provided clear lines of conduct, shared practices, interactions among institutions, so that serious disruption and disharmony among people was avoided. There were fewer problems, there were fewer uncertainties, there was greater human fulfillment. What's wrong with this? We have the Dark Ages cartoon that ignores evidence that contravenes its depiction of the Middle Ages. So too does the Golden Age cartoon. To be sure, the Middle Ages did not have modern forms of confusion, disruption, and social dislocation. By definition, it wasn't modern, it was medieval. But it definitely had its own forms. Hugely high, for us, high levels of violence in everyday life. Feuds, public fights, arguments, recurrent subsistence crises in which, when there wasn't enough food to go around, crops failed, people did starve to death. The Black Death, of course, of 1347 to 1351 killed at least a third and probably over 50% of Western Europe's population within just a few years. Lack of knowledge at the time of the natural world led people to think that they were being punished directly by God as a result of the Black Death. Or it simply was leading them into unforeseen and unprecedented levels of confusion and anxiety. There are examples of unsettling social disruption earlier in the Middle Ages as well. So, for example, the first response of the most serious Christians to the beginnings of the commercial revolution in the 11th and the 12th centuries were essentially run for the hills, get out of town. They're imitating basically the ancient desert fathers of the 4th century by becoming hermits. Again, someone like Peter Damian is an example of this. In the 12th century, the reaction is we need to get out, away from cities, away from the problems that are starting, and form new monastic orders. The Carthusians, the Cistercians, the Premonstratensians date from the 12th century. So the reaction to rapid change, to dislocation, to confusion with respect to economic transformations is social anxiety and it's renewed political conflicts. It's a huge mistake. This applies not only to the Middle Ages, but again, this is one of those kind of meta-historical insights that can be applied to any time and place. It's a huge mistake to confuse ideals with lived realities. Prescriptions with practices. Again, an important idea to keep in mind when understanding any historical period or indeed in current society today. We know that not all laws are actually followed, right? Okay, so too in other times and places. Actual medieval society was not a social, political, and cultural and economic externalization of the beautifully ordered thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. It was filled with sins and sinners of all kinds, filled with avarice and greed, envy and pride, anger and hatred, competition, resentment, and selfishness. That's one of the reasons why medieval saints stand out. Far from everybody was a saint in the Middle Ages. Saints were rare then, just like they're rare today. And indeed, a lot of examples of what are fairly regarded as superstitious practices and were regarded as such at the time by members of the most learned members of society, the most learned members of the clergy, are rife in the Middle Ages. So, things like, for example, stealing consecrated hosts, a power unlike any other, right? Grinding it up and spreading it on your crops so that they'll grow better. People did stuff like that. Yeah, exactly. I see. Yeah. But that's a certain understanding. Actually, you could see how somebody with an orthodox understanding gets the notion of like, well, consecrated hosts. I mean, that's actually the body of Christ. Jesus loves me, so if I sprinkle up ground up hosts on my crops, won't it grow better? Doesn't Jesus want my crops to grow better? You can see how a chain of thinking like that could be done. All kinds of magical incantations expectations survive from the Middle Ages. Curses accompany prayers. So you're praying for certain people, you're also praying that certain people, for example, meet their maker ASAP. We also shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that descriptions of sins and sinners applies to the laity, but not to the clergy. Or perhaps it applies to some parish clergy, but certainly not to members of religious orders, as if everyone, or even most men and women, who took vows of poverty actually lived in poverty. Again, the discrepancy between ideals on the one hand, realities on the other. There are absolutely endemic complaints about the clergy and members of religious orders for centuries in the Middle Ages. Certainly from no later than the 11th century, the most common complaint against the clergy in the Middle Ages, and it increases as the Middle Ages go on, up through the 15th century, the most common complaint is about their greed. They're always trying to squeeze the laity for some more, both in religious orders and among parish clergy and bishops. And, most famously, the most notorious examples of clerical greed are the papal court itself. In the 14th century, when the papacy is in Avignon for almost 80 years, in the late 15th and the early 16th century, among the Renaissance popes. Sixtus IV, I'm only going to give a couple juicy examples here. Sixtus IV, a Franciscan pope, right, St. Francis of Assisi, embraces lady poverty. Franciscan pope, his tiara, papal triple crown, right, in the early 1470s, cost 1/3 the value of the papal annual income. Franciscan pope. There's about poverty in action for you, right? Pope Leo X in the 15 teens more than doubled the number of church offices for sale, yeah, that's simony, to over 2,100. Nasty struggles occur between parish clergy, members of religious orders, over jurisdiction, over who has the right to, say, gather fees for hearing confessions. Within religious orders, there are really nasty infighting about who wants to reform and who doesn't. The Observantine movement in the 15th century is far from welcomed by all the members of the Benedictines, or the Dominicans, or the Franciscans, or the Augustinians. It creates divisions within these religious orders. Probably the deepest ones are among the Franciscans. So, summing up, make a long story short, in different ways, in different places, over time, the Middle Ages is riven with all kinds of tensions, contestations, and conflicts. There are different kinds of conflicts and problems, right, from those that characterize the modern world. But you don't have to read very much serious history about the Middle Ages to learn that this was an era replete with many difficulties. And nowhere more obviously or more commented upon between the 11th and the 15th centuries than in the church itself. There were constant calls to reform. Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th century, Francis of Assisi in the 13th century, Catherine of Siena in the 14th century, Jean Girson in the 15th, and more besides. Calling for reform, criticizing problems of the church, way before anybody ever heard of Martin Luther. Way before Martin Luther was even born. Okay, stand back now. Interim conclusion. What's the interim conclusion to be drawn? Right, the subtitle was Dark Ages of Superstitious Baptistness, right? Golden Age of Catholic Harmony, or neither. Neither wins. Neither of these mirror image caricatures of the Middle Ages is on the mark, even though both contain some elements of truth based on surviving sources and our best interpretations of the evidence. This was a deeply hierarchical society. It was one pervaded by Christian ideals, Christian assumptions and institutions, but it was not one in which these ideals were fully or even observably very observed. Yeah, exactly. It was a world of material scarcity and of natural vulnerability. But it wasn't one that for its time was based on what was known, was technologically stunted or anti-intellectual, even though the vast majority of the population was illiterate and had no formal education. Because in all societies that are peopled mostly by agricultural laborers, who else is going to do the work that's necessary to produce the food so that people can simply survive if everybody is studying and spending a lot of time in school and studying? You need a lot of steady, reliable agricultural surplus sustained year after year in any society, not just in Western society, in order to aspire to something like universal education. And that's why Western world, it doesn't even start to emerge as an ideal in Europe or in North America until the industrialized 19th century. So the Middle Ages really, I think, is best understood on the terms of its own protagonists between the 6th and the 15th centuries, allowing for acknowledging vast differences between Iceland and Sicily, right, between England and Italy. Anybody who's been to those countries recently knows they're not really all that similar. They were even more different at a time when there was almost no connection. But to recognize lots of changes and developments over time. And of course, anybody is always free to take your own assumptions and values and apply them, your commitments to the Middle Ages or to any other historical period of civilization. But if you do that, be prepared to see reflected back your own values and beliefs and commitments, because that's exactly what you see reflected back. It won't tell you anything about medieval men and women, what mattered to them, what life was like for them, what human life and its experiences and its challenges meant to them. To try to get at that, we have to do at least two things. The first is we have to be sufficiently self-aware about what our own beliefs and values and commitments are. That's a big thing in itself. It's a difficult thing to do. The second is we have to actually discipline ourselves to set those aside when we're trying to understand the Middle Ages or medieval Christianity or the medieval church. Until and unless we're willing to and able to do this, we won't be and we can't move toward a genuine historical understanding of the religions. Okay. Now, last bit here. Oh, it's not too bad. For me, okay. I thought it would be a little long-winded, going at a reasonable pace. Unlikely too many people fall asleep before the end is good. I said at the outset that when we're dealing with these images or these cartoons or caricatures of the Middle Ages, that usually something else besides a desire to understand the past is going on. And I want to conclude my remarks by saying something more about that, especially about the place of the Middle Ages and how they function in polemical, long-term narratives that actually reflect modern or contemporary values and commitments. And because in our society at large, it's the negative, dismissive caricature of the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, and that's much more common, often links to anti-Catholicism in one way or another. I'm going to concentrate on that. Now, I think if you think about it, you might not, in the instant that I say it, agree, but if you reflect on this after the lecture tonight, I think you will agree with what I'm about to say. And that is, to grow up in the early 21st century in the United States, or in Canada, or in a Western European country, in Mexico too. I should include Mexico because we are so close. Mexican citizens in the audience here. Delightful. To grow up in one of these countries in the early 21st century is to absorb, almost by a kind of cultural osmosis, without realizing it, a basic narrative about change over time, over the long term, what the French historians call la longue durée, a narrative that's built on a basic binary. This is the bedrock narrative that we absorb without knowing it, without ever taking a history class. It goes like this. Medieval, backward, oppressive, superstitious, religious, bad. Modern, enlightened, liberated, rational, secular, good. That's the fundamental foundation. The narrative from medieval to modern culminating in us is accordingly a narrative of progress. It's a narrative about how superstitious, oppressed, benighted, and primitively religious medieval Europeans, struggling to survive as village peasants, eventually developed and progressed into enlightened, liberated, autonomous, secular modern Westerners equipped with smartphones and globally connected via Instagram and Snapchat. Now, that's a bit of a caricature about the caricature, right? We're supposed to stick with this basic binary that underlies the narrative of progress, even if we nuance it, or, okay, we can see that, well, yeah, Chartres Cathedral is beautiful, medieval ivory or gold reliquaries are kind of impressive, appliances are pretty smart. But what we're not supposed to do is question the basic binary and the narrative that underlies it. Or, for example, the conflation that has occurred since the 17th century of divine providence, understood in Christian terms, with material progress understood in secular terms. The basic message is that over the last 5 or 6 centuries, the world is getting better. Anyone who doubts it should look around at all our cool technology, the amazing travel we can do, of course we have enough money, the medical innovations that prolong life more and more, how great it is to live in a world where we can believe whatever we want and buy as much as we want of whatever we want and do as we please without regard for anyone else. Those are the laws that protect our individual freedoms. We are all enculturated into this view of history, this view of change over time, before we ever take a history class or read a history book. It's the cultural air we breathe. And it's also the result of centuries of cultural layering that has denigrated and depend on criticizing the Middle Ages in order to make subsequent life look better by comparison. And that's so whether we're talking about, for example, the Renaissance, with its tripartite scheme of history as ancient, medieval, modern. That was invented in the Renaissance. Ancient, good, medieval, fell off a cliff, modern, then in the 14th and 15th century, good. Or when we're talking about the Protestant Reformation, a rediscovery of the gospel after centuries of medieval pagan philosophies, looking at you, Aristotle, clerical manipulations, unbiblical superstitions. Or when we're talking about the Enlightenment, autonomous reason as the basis for morality, as if nobody before the 17th century, right, knew what reason was. Okay, we'll just ignore ratio nomos for the entirety of all the ancient and medieval world. Political life, society, prosperity, after centuries of medieval ignorance, the age of religious wars and the Reformation period. Or when we're talking about 19th century industrialization and the use of science, the transformation of the natural world through science, its applications in technology, leading to ever more human enjoyment and happiness, in contrast to terrible medieval poverty and suffering. Or when we're talking about American individualism, with religious freedom and self-determination as an extension, a long-term extension of the Protestant Reformation, right? Everyone gets to determine for themselves what their truth is, ultimately over against the tyranny of popery. Now, the image of the Middle Ages that's most common today is some form of this negative caricature. It's an amalgam that's been rehashed and repeated. Its rejections of its repeated rejections intersect with and reinforce one another. They've been at work in one way or another since the 15th century, since the Renaissance humanists gave us that tripartite scheme. So it's no wonder that they are powerful, they're constantly recycled, and that they tend to have a life of their own without people being aware of it. When the image is invoked, it's usually with a polemical intent. That is, it's meant to trumpet modern individual freedom and self-determination as good, in contrast to the Middle Ages, when everyone was supposed to believe the same thing and was punished when they did. Or it's, for example, to ooh and ah about an incredible technology and capacity to master nature as good, in contrast to the Middle Ages, when people were pitifully at the mercy of natural forces that they couldn't control. Or it's to remind ourselves about how blessed we are to have separation of church and state, religion as a private personal matter in the secular public sphere, rather than religion as an organizing principle of public culture and society. So the Middle Ages here is functioning in a certain way. It's functioning as a kind of foil for the defense of values like modern liberalism, self-determination, secularism, and materialism, beliefs and ideologies like secularism and scientism and capitalist consumerism, and commitments to the power of technology and capitalist acquisitiveness as transformative of human lives and supposedly always for the better. Now, one would think that after the history of the world in the 20th century, with its estimated 190 million people killed in its brutal recurrent wars and genocides, that would have been sufficient to disabuse more people of naive narratives of historical progress and the basic binary that lies underneath them. But not just the 20th century. Today, you think, for example, of the combination of our global environmental predicament, the Anthropocene, ongoing and current warfare, an estimated over 100 million current refugees in the world, the millions of lives being destroyed as we speak through human trafficking, the resurgence of authoritarian politics, rampant disinformation and conspiracy theories, and indeed our own current national political situation would be sufficient to inspire more nuanced views of change over time and more differentiated assessments of what different historical periods have done well and what they've done less well, including not only the modern era and our old times, but indeed also the Middle Ages. They weren't all darkness, and our own times are far from all goodness and light. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your excellent talk. We have a few minutes for Q&A, so if you want to ask something, please raise your hand. And also, Gregory, if you want to pick the one that you like the most.
The ones I like the most, yes. So I don't think you know what I'm messaging.
So,
Go ahead. I'd like you.
Should the students go first? Okay. I have maybe two questions. One, a comparative one, and the first one is, you describe the medieval life in general, first one way, then the other, and somewhere in the middle you make a mention of the lives of men and lives of women, but you do not elaborate. So I'd like to know, both in the bad image and good image, how the lives of men and women were different.
Yeah.
And the other comparative question is, I would very much like to know the time that you describe in Europe. It is exactly the same time when the Islamic world is at its peak.
Exactly. That's right.
That is the peak time of the Abbasid Caliphate.
Exactly.
So I'd like to know what is the relationship between the two, not the usual story of the crusade, but something else.
No, I'm only laughing because it's like, could you compare the entirety of the Christian Middle Ages and the entirety of the Islamic Middle Ages? A huge question, of course. So the first question, right, about men and women, which I didn't talk about gender as one of the issues about. It's no secret, absolutely the case, that the Middle Ages, as almost all traditional societies, a handful of exceptions in the history of humanity, overwhelmingly a hierarchically understood relationship between men positive, women in lesser positions, in terms of authority, in terms of opportunities, etc. So absolutely that's the case. And I think on the plus side of the ledger, largely speaking, almost everyone regards the modern era as having been far, far better for women than the Middle Ages were. There's no question about that. So that's the short answer to that question. On the other hand, right, there also, and this isn't just, I mean, many of the difficulties I think that confront modern individuals, some of them are gendered in various ways, but other ones I think apply across men and women. Questions about isolation, depression, and so forth, individual burdens in ways, but these I think are related to broader ways in which kind of social networks, neighborhoods, kinship, connections, and so forth have, I think, deteriorated to a much, much greater extent in the modern world than was the case in the Middle Ages. What do you want me to comment on about Islam and Christian? I mean, I'm not interested in the Crusades, not the issue.
No. Here is what when we normally teach the introduction to philosophy. You start with the Greeks.
Yeah, of course. And then the Islamic world is the
right.
the
Then you go to the
tradition.
medievals, the acceptance of Aristotle in the Charge of Doctrine. But what you normally is obscured in that story is that the Islamic tradition too equally inherited Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'd like to know, since there are two followers on both sides, but subscribe to different principle of God and church and so on.
Absolutely.
There must have been some relation between the two, which is more detailed than the usual crusade story.
Yeah, I mean the Crusades are a conflictual relationship between the two. But were it not for the ways in which the later Roman Empire, the eastern part of the empire, the Greek-speaking part of the empire, that then first is overrun by the Persians in the early 7th century. The next decade, here comes this new movement, right? The Muslims in the early 7th century. Within a century, they take it over essentially the entirety of North Africa, all the way over most of the Spanish Peninsula. But if it weren't for the flowering, based especially in Cordoba in Spain in the 9th and the 10th and the 11th centuries, had the Islamic tradition not preserved Aristotle in Islamic, Arabic translation, I should say, there's no way that Aristotle would have been transmitted to the latecomers, namely Western Europeans. So it's not until the 12th and 13th century that the connections between, and it's really, it's the peninsula of the three religions, as it's Islam, Judaism, and Christianity in the Middle Ages that makes the Iberian Peninsula so distinctive and so interesting in that respect. And that the interactions and the complexities of the relationships among the peoples of those three traditions are absolutely not a matter of people at one another's throats all the time. These are people that are interacting with one another in urban environments and so forth. There's sharing among intellectuals. There are Christians that learn Arabic and vice versa. Muslims that learn Latin and Spanish in those contexts. So that hopefully that gets at a bit of what you're talking about. I mean, it's a big story.
I mean, of late, I looked up some story of the Ottoman Empire. Of course, the Ottomans are later than the period we're talking about.
Starting in the 16th
They come after
century.
the 16th. But still, I discovered these bit of information that almost all Ottoman princes learned Italian from the tutors.
Mm-hmm.
And when Machiavelli's book came out, they were the first people to order a copy. So they spoke fluent Italian, and they knew pretty much everything Europe, but they said that we are going to do things differently.
Yeah, but of course Machiavelli articulates principles that lots of different people recognize, because these are bare knuckle principles about the way power works, but the ways to appear like you're not exercising it too brutally. So, thanks for your questions. In the back.
Yeah, so I really appreciate the idea of, we have a form of certain caricature in our minds, of like what the Middle Ages was, but you said the call to action towards the end of your presentation. How would we go about bursting that bubble of like certain people? Because I don't know, I kind of want to do something about it or bring people towards it, but like I don't want to go to a party and be like, hey, you know about the Middle Ages? I want something, something conventional, something I can point to.
They call it teacher, man, right? That's where we hope to have an impact of that. But the sheer kind of the armor, the longevity, the power, the survivability of these kinds of images, despite there is massive amounts of knowledge out there. Anybody who actually wants to learn about these things has, and now through the wonders of instantly accessible digital technology, thumbs up to that, right? You can search and find and download countless scholarly articles in local languages instantly. Anybody who wants to learn and disabuse themselves of those kind of things can do so. But these images have power. Those two cartoons or caricatures that I sketched, right? They serve a function. I mean, I know quite a few Catholics who cling desperately to more or less a model of the golden age of the Middle Ages, because it's an easy kind of nostalgic contrast to so many of the things that we see and object to and find difficult and problematic about the modern world. So it's nice to imagine a world when everything was so much better. It's hard to know, we don't have a time machine, but if we did, and we could all kind of gather in it and say, okay, let's go 1384 Florence. We're all there. We could spend a few days there. I bet you anything, after a few days living in that society, 100% of us would run back to the time we know now. People don't want to live in that world. Not when we've been acculturated into the kinds of comforts, opportunities, taken for granted things. You flip a light switch, there's light. You turn on hot water, there's hot water. You look at in the fridge, and there's food. You go in the freezer, you got 3 kinds of ice cream. We don't want to live in that world. It would shock the crap out of us to go back in the Middle Ages. And that's the technical description. But if you want to try to fight against these, You know, this is the question, you're asking a question about education and its influence in society, essentially. Why can't we just get people to know stuff, right? Wouldn't that be great? Would have been awesome over the last few months before the last election. That would have been fantastic. We had educated populace, amazing. Would have been amazing. But we don't. So, you know, things happen as they did. Yeah.
I think perhaps a caveat off of his question, maybe the approach to go about it would be to not only question the narratives that are pushed by, you know, popular media, pop culture, not only about the Middle Ages, but about any historical period or
Amen.
event in...
Preach, this is Ricardo. He's not showing me around today too. And I know he's a history major, so we've already connected. But we did not collude. I didn't know he was going to ask. Do you want to say more? I'm sorry.
No, it's just, I mean, that's mostly it, to just question pop culture narratives, educational narratives that we've always been pushed on.
Exactly.
And recognize that these narratives serve a purpose, like you said,
Exactly.
to paint a picture, to think about the past in a certain way. And I think my friend Pablo said that has an influence over the present.
Exactly.
And if we can control how the past is viewed, we can control what people think in the present.
Precisely. And that's part of the reason why it's absolutely frightening that there are some states in this country, I mean, Florida's leader, they want to control the way history is taught, you know? Don't tell people that there were aspects of the United States that were less than gold and wonderful and makes them have this warm feeling in them. Don't dwell on the fact that there was absolutely no way that the United States would have become an industrial power in the 19th century were it not for slavery. Because that's where all the cotton came from, right? That was sold and helped to fuel the industrial powerhouse that the U.S. became, etc. There are super disturbing things about the history of our country. Let's not teach them so that kids don't get, you know, a critical idea about their own country. Because you wouldn't want that.
Yeah, I feel like they want to hide the truth from the real generation.
On the other hand, though, you have the let's focus on all the grievances.
That's that too, and that's. But again, this is you're right. You kind of this is the two sides of what
Right,
I
they're both
like,
excesses.
right? Because if you only emphasize the bad, you know, really, were there no good people in the 19th century? They're all a bunch of racist jerks, right? I remember John Brown.
So before we do balance of education and nature, what we balance to teach, so we get into that.
That I think is something that every teacher has to decide for him or herself. And I think it depends on the particular. All teaching is a matter of audience first. You have to get a sense of your students, where they are, what you think their background is, and so forth, because if you pitch it too high or assume too much, disaster. If it's too low, they'll start, you know, checking their phones and checking out already. So, but that, I don't think there's a single formula of it. That requires the kind of prudential judgment that, you know, every teacher I think has to, you know, understand. Just drive to use. Yeah.
I was thinking, is there a chance to compare, for example, these prejudgments about the Middle Age to thinking of Edward Said's Orientalism's notion that it is like this completely biased vision about this context that promotes like these stereotypes and archetypal visions about the context.
So this is a question on the Islamic scholar Edward Said wrote an incredibly influential book called Orientalism in early 80s. Do you know what year it was? 85?
Yes, I think.
Early 83, around there. So does anybody know?
I graduated in '84 and I read Edward Said, so it was way before that.
80,
He was in
81.
paperback in
Might have been
82.
79 then. Okay, good, thanks, Mark. My sister-in-law. Yeah, no, but very much a similar structure to what I talked about. And that one actually goes back to your question about Western conceptions of the East, Orientals, broadly speaking, sometimes lumped into a giant kind of undifferentiated expanse that extends from Israel all the way to China, right? I mean, you know, everything west of Western or east of Western Europe is the Orient. But I think that he's getting at the same kinds of issues that I'm talking about here, distorting kind of stereotypes of broad conceptions that serve a function, right? They serve a purpose in the present. That's the present day work that these views of the past or different cultures and civilizations are serving. So yeah, Hank has a great analogy. Yeah.
Kind of changing the topic a little bit, but you mentioned the Cistercian and Carthusian orders that came about and kind of how they were fleeing from society. But at the same time, I think we have the Franciscan and Dominican orders that come into society with their not having to be cloistered.
Exactly correct. Did you have more? I'm sorry, I have a terrible thing. I get excited about the question and I butt in. So did you want to finish your thoughts?
No, that was just kind of the whole
Think about those two,
relationship.
compare those two.
Yeah, because you mentioned the Cistercians, Carthusians, kind of that element of like orders that want to be more strict and leave society, but then the Franciscans, they have poverty because it lets them be in society without getting tied down.
Exactly correct. And so this is kind of like two waves of responses to the increased commercial life, the growth of cities in the Middle Ages, sorry, the 11th and 12th centuries. The first wave are hermits. Then we get new forms of shared monastic contemplative life. Cistercians, Carthusians, Premonstratensians, Norbertines, those two are the same thing. But the next movement, the movement of the friars, of the mendicant orders, the Franciscans, Dominicans, also the Augustinians, they are, essentially it's like this. These cities aren't going away. Commerce is not going away. Urban poverty is not going away. So we're going to have to find a way to combine, because neither are the demands of the gospel going away. So we've got to find a way, right, to pastor, administer, and be present in the culture now, right, in the cities and the urban environment that's been created. So the friars are definitely, it's almost, because we, people who care about the religious lives, Catholics who care about the religious lives now, assume that of course you're going to care about people like out in the world and so forth. I mean, there are contemplative forms of Catholic spirituality still, of course, but the presumption is that it's about service, right? It's about service out in the world. And that's a long-term descendant of what the Franciscan Dominicans are doing in the 13th century. At the time, though, these guys are freaks in the early 13th century. The critiques that are made of them by the members of established monastic communities are just like, what are you doing? That's not a vow, that's not a religious vow. Because somebody who takes religious vows goes to a monastery, they take a vow of stabilitas, right? Not of, as far as these guys are concerned, insanitas. And you don't go out and, hang out with lepers and poor people in the street. You don't go and preach against the Albigensians like the Dominicans do. So the newness of that form of religious life in the 13th century is stunning. One of I teach a humanities seminar, honors humanities seminar at Notre Dame, and among the texts we read in the first semester, we read the Rule of St. Benedict, and then a couple weeks later we read the Rule of St. Francis. And they're just like, well, they're both about humility, but they're totally, radically different forms. So anyway, it's just a great setup of your question for me to go on and on like this, so thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. So in my experience studying at the university and teaching in different institutions, I've noticed that there's a jump specifically in philosophy from the ancient times to the modern times. And in the medieval times, we only study or we only talk about St. Thomas, St. Augustine, St. Thomas, sometimes Occam, right? So I've noticed that we have, my question is, how do you think our societies could benefit from the ideas in that were used, or the way people used to organize politically or economically in medieval times? How do you think those ideas or those practices could benefit our societal organization today, like in terms of political organization, economically organization, that maybe we don't, those ideas that maybe we don't know or we forgot, our society maybe forgot, that could benefit our society today?
Yeah, I mean, it's a broad question. I mean, in certain respects, I think it's just a matter of just knowing more completely and less distortingly kind of, you know, the continuities between the ancient world through the Middle Ages and up to the present, not thinking, and philosophy is a great example. I was talking today, where is Raphael? There, yes, we were talking, and I asked him, I said specifically, I said, can you take, he's a philosophy major, can you take a course in specifically medieval philosophy right here at UTEP? Because there are some universities where the philosophy department is so constituted that, yes, you know, Plato, Aristotle, make up from Plotinus, if you're lucky you can, and then it's sort of like, oh, Descartes. It's like, jump to the 17th century, right? So, in those terms, I mean, yeah, there were lots of things that were going on intellectually in the middle of that time. But other kinds of things about the Middle Ages, some of the things I alluded to in my lecture. The commerce and the quickening of economic life that starts in the Middle Ages, right, continuous through the period of you know, later 15th century into the early modern period and so forth. That starts in the Middle Ages. It doesn't suddenly begin in the 16th or the 17th centuries. There are really important political thinkers in the Middle Ages and expressions of politics. Some of the Italian city-states as early as the 11th and the 12th century, right? They start to constitute themselves and conceive themselves in what could be considered sort of proto-democratic ways. All the citizens of a certain community, men, not women, almost never. Sometimes widows, but not very often. Anyway, so these are medieval developments. In fact, we're going to have a conference at Notre Dame next year. One of my colleagues in classics is organizing it, and it's an interdisciplinary study about democratic ideas in the Middle Ages. So these are, you know, but that's just a kind of familiarization. Democracy didn't, you know, sort of have a moment in ancient Greece, disappear under the Roman Empire. Nothing, of course, there's nothing going on in the Middle Ages. And then suddenly, you know, burst forth in the Enlightenment with thinkers like John Locke and, you know, of course, quickly getting the American founding fathers and getting the U.S., right, where all great things culminate. So there's just a couple things off the top of my head. But again, it's your question in a way about how can it benefit society. It's kind of like your question about, you know, how can we, and it's also kind of like your question about, you know, how do we effectuate this? Those of us who are teachers or engaging with wider public in some way or form. Yeah.
Oh, Lisa?
You.
Look, I just want to say thank you for being here. One of the big things that I was wondering about is, I do want to learn more about medieval conflicts, kind of going past the golden age of Italian, kind of learning about kind of the conflicts that would arise among these different nation states and different communities. Is there any interesting literature that I could look into?
Oh gosh. I'm always, I should have, you know, a bibliography in my head ready for any question that somebody asks, but specifically about medieval conflicts.
Yes. Or like major warfares, wars of any kind.
Well, I mean, I don't have specific titles and authors for you, but you could read, for example, about the 100 Years' War in between England and France in the 14th and 15th centuries, for example. You could read about the Crusades, which are extremely interesting and also been heavily studied. Really, really important for back and forth relationships, because it's not just warfare, it's not just Christians going to the Middle East, but it's also all kinds of things that are brought back as a result of that. And then at the later and specifically in England, there's a large literature on the Wars of the Roses in England, which leads into and up to, that's where the Tudor dynasty comes from, which is basically the winners of the Wars of the Roses. So those are a few things off the top of my head, but there's also a significant literature about kind of smaller scale conflicts in the Middle Ages, like conflicts within communities. Two powerful families, right, that find themselves in competition and antagonism with one another. Sometimes it goes on over generations. I mean, this is the kind of thing that lies behind Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, for example, which news, right? So we have suddenly people, oh yeah, I know about that. So, but that's more of a much broader phenomenon. And there's significant literature on violence in the Middle Ages as well. But now it's just so easy to find out about this stuff. You know, I mean, everybody knows Google Scholar, right? I was telling my student, no Google allowed, but you can use Google Scholar, right? You can find, you know, search Middle Ages, community violence, and you'll have enough to keep you busy for a long time. All right? Good. Yeah.
So to add to the Google Scholar, we just has a scholar that is for us, for our students.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Right. But a question, sort of his question. My philosophy formation is fairly, but it's more the Kant or the Socrates. So what good philosopher in the Middle Ages do you recommend reading to learn the modern Middle Age philosophy?
This is really, I really consider, Augustine I don't really consider a medieval Greek philosophy. He's a late antique philosophy. He's more ancient than he is, although Augustine I think is much more readily accessible than St. Thomas Aquinas. Who here has really tried seriously to read Aquinas? Be honest. Yeah. And what do you think? Easy? Theological. Aquinas is not easy. He's, I just had my students read 40 pages of Aquinas on the virtues, and they're just like, I mean, it's not that it's unclear, it's that it's a whole conceptual world, deeply, it assumes so much knowledge and mastery over Aristotelian thought, and that itself is really off-putting. I would say, I think it's probably in some ways easier to read, say, medieval political thought than it is to read, you know, epistemology or metaphysics. Metaphysics is really difficult. You have to know a lot. But I would say, again, the best way to learn about anything you don't know anything about, I don't mean that about you, but people in general, read very basic things to start with. When I don't know something at all about an area I want to learn about, because I've done a lot of reading on the ancient world in recent years, and I knew very little about it other than Greece and Rome beforehand. I go to the Oxford very short introduction. Serious people know everybody should know this. A very short introduction, Oxford University Press. There are now over 500 titles of this. Each book is like 100 pages. Short, all of them are written by experts. They're really a good introduction, and they all have a good bibliography. Oxford very short introductions. That's a great gateway. It's like a good gateway.
Very short.
Yeah. Very short introductions, yeah.
This is more like a curiosity rather than a question about what we are talking about here. But since you talked so much about monks and the monastic tradition and their vows, what is the current state of monastic tradition in the Western world? Is it going downhill? Is it going to disappear?
I mean, it's you know, I think pretty much it's sort of holding steady. I mean, it's you know, it's less than it was, say, a century ago. But I think the kind of immediate post-Vatican II, you know, sort of cratering out, both avowed monastic life, and for example, the Dominicans and in the United States are really thriving. Now that's the friars, but both their house of studies in Berkeley and in Washington they have a lot of young friars. So
yeah, I asked this because I recently went to South Korea to see the Buddhist monasteries. And I thought that too was coming to an end, but apparently no. I mean, they are having a great enrollment every year.
Yes, this is another one of those macro narratives that's related to what I was talking about. You know, old, way back, primitive peoples don't know any better, religious, you know. But now that we're scientific and technological, obviously there's been enough religious revival in the modern world in multiple traditions. I think for that completely to be blown out of the water. I'm going to just want to say, because we have dinner reservations somewhere, we're probably already late.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Okay, all right. I just want to Are you guys, is this 2 questions, or are you putting up your hands together to make sure one of you gets it?
My first question is, can my buddy go after me?
That was your question.
Just like a genie, right? You get 3 minutes. Right? Well, yeah, that's the first one. Go on.
So my question is, what attitude was being pushed by the clergy during the Middle Ages in terms of eschatology? Was it more optimistic or pessimistic?
This is an inside baseball question. Right? Eschatology, right? doctrines, teachings, ideas about the end of the world and time and so forth. There's not one, this is back to the complexity of the Middle Ages, right? There's not one thing about that. There is kind of intense medieval eschatological expectation at different times and places. But it's not a kind of consistent thing that, steady. So, for example, one of the responses, and if we can understand why it's yourself, the Black Death, right, in the middle of the 14th century, is intense eschatological expectation. If half the population of Western Europe is dead within 5 years, that looks like the end of the world. And why not the second half, right, in the next 5 years? So, certain kinds of cataclysmic events like that tend to, engender apocalyptic expectations in a kind of intense way. So it's less, by negative or positive, you mean kind of people are chill about the end of the world, or they're sort of anxious about it?
What I mean is, and maybe this is like kind of a newer development that has been led by the reformers, but will the world get better the sooner it's coming to an end, or will it get worse?
Oh, almost everybody thinks it'll get worse. Okay. Yeah, it's not. We're not like gradually easing into, the end is not going to be good. It's going to be destructive. Well, there are those bits and pieces in the Gospel of Jesus, earthquakes and floods and fires, and so there'll be, all these problems and so forth. So I don't know any medieval author that thinks like there's kind of be like an upward on-ramp to the end times. Things are going to get worse. And the question is, how intensely or how anxious are people about that in kind of, immediate way? That rises and falls in different ways. Joachim of Fiore is an important 12th century figure who has a significant influence at the time that's a sort of an undercurrent. Different Franciscan authors pick him up in the 13th century.
Could you spell his name?
Sure. J-O-A. He's writing it on his hand. That is serious dedication. Joachim of Fiore is a town, it was F-I-O-R-E. Got it, man. You know what he's going to be reading tonight. I'm going to go to her. Is that okay?
Ladies first.
Back to her smart interjection of the question about gender in the Middle Ages. Ask me afterward. But then I'm going to take 2 more.
What about later on in the medieval period where the church was kind of seeing a problem, just emphasizing the end of times with, is the rise of the Gothic architecture, for example, more of a early Renaissance or a late medieval or kind of in the middle? Because again, there was a shift from like the tympanum by Gislevertus in Aachen. It's only about the end of the world, for example, just the Last Judgment, and then with Gothic architecture, it starts to be an emphasis on light, on the Virgin Mary, and hope.
You had a course on medieval architecture, medieval art history and architecture, and she remembered something from it, or are you in it right now?
I graduated from art history.
Good question. Good. So the question about shifts in architectural style in the Middle Ages and the relationship to eschatology. You were inspired by hearing this question. All connected. And this is going to be broad generalization, right? We've got Romanesque, and we've got Gothic, and then we're going to have a kind of classical revival. It starts really in the Renaissance. So you get rounded arches rather than pointy arches. But the question of iconography, the exteriors of major churches, for example, most typically, and I think this is something you can correct me if I'm wrong, carries over from some of the Romanesque churches to the Gothic in this respect. Typically, over the tympanum, right? This is the art over the main doorway of the main entrance to a church. The the most common depiction is a depiction of the Last Judgment. And the Last Judgment, of course, is, well, it depends on which side you are. Really good if you're on one side, right, and really awful if you're on the other. So that's the way in which this is straight out of Matthew 25. You know, Jesus is going to separate the sheep from the goats. It's a kind of depiction in stone of the anticipation of that future event. So that I don't see a significant change in the move to Gothic. You're absolutely right though about, I mean, Gothic is about, you know, what the abbot Sujet, right, is the instigator, the inventor of Gothic art, who calls the metaphysics of light. That's where we get stained glass, right? That's where we get Chartres and Notre Dame, these extraordinary 12th and 13th century churches made possible by architectural innovations, back to technology in the Middle Ages, that will support that much space that isn't stone. Romanesque churches have little windows because they need the structure of the walls to hold up the massive thing. What the Gothic architects figure out is how we can take away some wall space and devote it to windows. And not just any windows, right? Amazing, colored, beautiful windows. So, okay. One more question. We're in overtime now.
So, how would you say society in like the lands of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, differed from Western Europe, and how would you say the relations between Western Europe and or the Eastern Roman Empire was? How would you describe the relations between the two?
I mean, in the Middle Ages now, not when there's still an Eastern Roman Empire.
Kind of like the latter medieval.
Okay. I mean, the biggest difference, of course, is that the Byzantine world, before the Ottoman Empire, is an Orthodox Christian world. It's a Greek. It looks to the Greek church fathers. It has a. I mean, theologically, they're extremely close. Certainly compared to the difference between Catholics and Protestants, and the relationship between Orthodox Christian and Catholic Christianity in the Middle Ages is much closer than that. Even though they're quite distinctive in sort of their aesthetics of their liturgy, the kind of the emphasis in the Orthodox tradition much more heavily on mystery, on transcendence, on a kind of aesthetic, spiritual experience that they don't have to the same extent. The emphasis on the use of critical discursive rationality to try to understand and analyze and build an interconnected theological system like we have in Western scholasticism. They never use Aristotle as a kind of foundational analytical tool to kind of, you know, we can use this rationally to articulate the theology. And so today my Orthodox friends are always, saying, I'm Catholic, we kill Christianity by all these distinctions and doctrine and specification and so forth. That's one difference. The other huge difference, major difference, and almost impossible to overestimate. And this just comes from a colleague of mine, who's a brilliant Orthodox theologian and just a fantastic philosopher and thinker. And I think he's absolutely right. He said the key difference between Orthodox Christianity, Byzantine Empire on one hand, theologically anyway, and the West, one word, Augustine. Augustine's influence on the Western tradition is massive, hugely influential in Catholicism and also in the Protestant tradition, both Lutheranism and Reformed Protestantism. And he's virtual footnote, really non-entity in substantive terms in Orthodox Christianity. That has huge implications, partly because of Augustine's particular distinctive emphasis on original sin and human nature, fallen human nature, and also the way in which, and I think this is more for worse than for better, the extent to which Augustine connects it with sexuality. That gives the Western tradition a different inflection on all kinds of things related to moral theology that the Eastern Orthodox tradition doesn't have. So anyway, just a couple of things. All right, I'm tired. Thank you all very much.